The night was quiet and cold, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath. 17-year-old Aisha hurried home, clutching her old bag of textbooks to her chest. The streets of their neighborhood always seemed deserted to her, but today the silence was ominous. Her faithful dog, Baxter, trudged along beside her, guarding her peace as always. They turned down a short alley when suddenly headlights blinded them, cutting through the night darkness. A loud siren, short and commanding, made her freeze. "Hey, you!" The voice, rough and full of contempt, came from a patrol car that had stopped just a few feet away from her. Aisha had no sooner taken a step than the car door opened with a bang, and a tall white man in a police uniform strode toward her. His gait was confident, almost lazy, and there was something grim in his eyes. "What are you doing here, huh? Did you decide to steal something?" His words sounded like a spit in my face. Aisha was confused but tried to explain. "I'm just going home. This is my neighborhood." "Your neighborhood?" He laughed mockingly, slowly stepping around her. "Since when do people like you get to call something your own? Come on, show me what's in your bag." Baxter growled warily, stepping between Aisha and the policeman. "Keep your dog on a leash, girl, or I'll calm him down myself," he growled angrily. "He's not aggressive." Aisha stepped forward, covering the dog, but hatred flashed in the cop's eyes. "Don't you realize who you're talking to?" He stepped closer, looming over her. "You think I'm gonna let some nigger girl cross me?" Aisha froze. Every word hurt, making her heart clench with fear and anger. The policeman approached Baxter and raised his hand on his weapon with cold determination. "A dog? That's not your defense. It's a problem, and I know how to solve problems fast." She screamed, begging him to stop, but he had already taken a step forward, his face contorted with contempt. The moon peeked out from behind the clouds for a moment, illuminating his form as a symbol of power that became not a defense, but a threat to her. In that moment, she realized that this man was more than just a policeman. He was the embodiment of all the hatred she had felt for so many years, and the nightmare was just beginning. Baxter growled louder and louder, his fur standing up. It wasn't just a sound. It was rage, mixed with a protective instinct born of love for his mistress. Aisha clutched at his collar, feeling a shiver run through her body. But her fear increased when she saw the policeman reaching for his gun. "I said, put that dog away, girl," he bellowed, his voice booming like a gunshot, cutting through the silence of the night. Aisha tried to soothe the dog, her words coming off as sobs. "He's just protecting me, please. He won't do anything to hurt you." But the man did not hear her. His gaze slid over her with contempt, as if he were not a human being but a disenfranchised shadow. The next second, he drew his gun. "I don't repeat myself twice." Baxter, as if realizing the danger, rushed forward. Aisha screamed as it all happened in a split second. The piercing sound of a gunshot shattered the silence of the night. Time slowed down, and she saw her faithful friend fall to the ground. Her heart sank. "No! No!" exclamation mark. A scream burst from her chest, and she fell to her knees beside Baxter. His eyes, still alive, stared up at her, blood oozing from his sides. She wrapped her trembling arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "Please, hold on. Please, Dot. Dot, Dot," she whispered, feeling his breathing grow fainter and fainter. The policeman only stood with his weapon holstered and watched her suffering with a smirk. "I warned you. Maybe now you'll learn to obey." The words struck like a whip. His indifference was unbearable. Aisha raised her head, her eyes full of tears meeting his icy gaze. "He didn't do anything to you. You killed him for nothing." Just like that, he smirked. "That animal was a threat. So are you, if you continue to act like this." Aisha felt rage rising inside her, intertwined with helplessness. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but she knew that any movement could be her last. She looked at Baxter again, his eyes closed and his body weakened in her arms. Her friend, her protector, was dead, and all she could do was mourn him. But in that moment, through the pain and tears, something new stirred in her heart. It wasn't just grief, it was determination. She knew she would not let this go unpunished, and even if the whole world was against her, she would fight for him, for herself, for those victimized by the likes of this policeman. That night, Aisha lost more than a friend. She lost her faith in justice, but, in return, she gained a rage that would become her weapon. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Have you or your loved ones had similar situations in your life? How have you dealt with injustice? Your stories are important, and perhaps they will help others. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. And here we go. Aisha remained on her knees, her hands still holding Baxter's breathless body. The world around her seemed to freeze, leaving her in a vacuum of pain and rage. But the loud sound of footsteps on the pavement brought her back to reality. The policeman was approaching slowly, his boots thudding on the ground as if measuring every second of her terror. "So, have you calmed down, girl?" His voice was filled with cold mockery. He stopped a few paces away from her, looking down from above as if he were looking at the trash lying by the roadside. "Or do you want to end up like that dog, too?" Aisha looked up at him, her eyes full of anger and tears. But her silence only aggravated him. He leaned lower, almost touching her face with his scornful gaze. "Look how brave you are. You think you're special? You think someone's going to come and save you? Nobody, you hear me? You're just another dirty girl who doesn't know her place." Her heart was pounding so loudly that it felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. She wanted to scream, but fear held her back. She knew this man was capable of anything. His smile of contempt told her that he was enjoying her helplessness. People like you, always think they're owed something. You think you're the victims? No, you're the problem. You're clogging up this city, this country. You think anyone would miss you if you disappeared? His words were like knives cutting into her soul. She could hardly hold back her tears, realizing that any movement she made could be the occasion for a new aggression. The policeman straightened up, put his hands in his pockets, and began to walk slowly around her like a predator playing with prey. "You know, I could just put you in my car, drive you somewhere far away, and get rid of you. No one would have noticed. And then I could say you resisted arrest. Everyone would believe it. You want to check it out?" Aisha felt her hands begin to tremble. She clenched her fists, trying to hide her fear, but she knew he could see right through her. The policeman stopped behind her, his shadow falling across her shoulders. "I see, you're not talking. And you're doing the right thing. Because if you open your mouth, I'll make you disappear forever. No one will even ask where you are. What about your family? They'd better keep quiet if they want to live in peace." Those words came down on her like stones. She knew there was truth in his words. The system she was supposed to trust was on his side. Her anger grew stronger, but it was useless in the face of this relentless machine of power and hate. "And don't look at me like that. You have no right to look at me. You're nobody, okay? Nobody." He stepped closer and poked her in the shoulder so hard she staggered. Aisha couldn't stand it and whispered, "You killed him. For nothing." His eyes flashed. He bent over, bringing his face close to hers. "Yes, I have killed. And what are you going to do about it? Complain? To whom? No one will believe you, because I am the law, and there's nothing you can do about it." She could feel her breathing becoming ragged. At that moment she realized the depth of her helplessness. This man had all the power, and she was just a pawn in his game. But a fire began to ignite within her. It was a fire of rage, hatred, and determination. He thought he had broken her, but he had awakened something that would become his greatest fear. The policeman gave her another look full of contempt and turned around. "Go home before I change my mind, and you'd better forget you ever saw me, or the next time you see me will be your last." His words echoed in her head until he got into his car and drove away. Aisha was alone in the middle of the night, with Baxter's body at her feet and a broken heart. But there wasn't just fear in her eyes now. There was an oath there. This man thought he was stronger. What he didn't know was that she would do anything to get justice. The next morning, Aisha could still feel the pain in her chest, as if her breath was chained. She knew she had to do something, to tell someone, to get justice for Baxter. Gathering all her courage, she headed to the local police department, hoping that there would be people inside the system willing to listen to her. The police building seemed cold and threatening. The uniformed men who passed by didn't even look in her direction. She approached the desk where a uniformed woman with a tired expression was on duty. "What can I do for you?" she asked dryly, without raising her eyes. "I want to file a complaint against a policeman." Aisha's voice shook, but she tried to speak confidently. The woman on duty finally looked up, a look of annoyance in her eyes. "A policeman? What did he do?" Aisha took a deep breath, trying to suppress her tears. "He threatened me, killed my dog, just like that." The words elicited a short laugh from a man passing by. He stopped to listen. "Are you sure you're not exaggerating, girl? Maybe your dog was lunging at him?" "No." Baxter was being kind. "He was just protecting me because that man started making threats." Aisha felt anger rising inside her. "Threats? Are you sure?" The desk clerk wrote something down on the paper, but her tone was mocking. "You realize this is a serious charge? Do you know the officer's name?" "No, but I can describe him. It was last night. He said I was nobody and could disappear. He shot my dog for nothing." The man standing next to him hummed. "The detectives are going to love your story. I guess we'll write it all down. Though maybe you just misunderstood something. You know, sometimes black people, you see threats where there aren't any." Those words hit her like a punch from a fist. "What?" She could not contain her indignation. "It's not a fiction. He said he could do whatever he wanted and he wouldn't get hurt for it." The woman on duty raised her hand, urging her to calm down. "Look, I'm just doing my job. We'll pass this upstairs, but don't expect much. We've got serious business here, not a squabble over a dog." "It's not just a dog," Aisha shouted out. "It's a life, and he threatened me. You have to do something." A man standing off to the side came closer, leaned toward her and whispered, "Listen, girl, we protect our own. You better go home and forget about this. You want trouble? You'll have them if you make any noise." Aisha felt her legs shaking. They all looked at her with the same expression, indifference mixed with contempt. She tried to say something, but at that moment the voice of that policeman rang in her head. "No one will listen to you. No one will believe you." She turned and ran out of the station, feeling her world crumble. The whole system she was supposed to trust was against her. Her fear was replaced by despair. She thought she would at least find help here, but she realized she was up against something much bigger than an individual officer. It was an entire mechanism that protected its own while ignoring those like her. When Aisha got home, she sat on her bed, clutching the picture of Baxter in her hands. Her grief overwhelmed her, but something else grew with it. She already knew that justice would not come on its own. She would have to fight for it, even if it cost her everything. Aisha sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes staring off into nothing. She was still clutching Baxter's old collar, the only thing left of her friend. The words of the police officers, their taunts, their threats, swirled in her head. She felt small, defenseless, cornered. But at that moment she was reminded of her mother's words. Long ago she had mentioned an uncle, her father's brother, whom she hardly knew. He rarely showed up at family gatherings, always serious, silent, like a shadow. Everyone said he was a police officer, but they never specified what he did. Aisha decided she had no more choice. She found her mother's old address book, flipped through it with trembling hands, and came across a familiar name. Underneath it was a phone number. She dialed it, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. The tone of the long beep stretched on endlessly. Then came a low, steady voice. "Bryant here." Aisha swallowed, trying to suppress her excitement. "Uncle Bryant? It's Aisha." The silence lasted longer than she wanted it to. "Aisha? Girl, what's wrong? Why are you calling?" She began to tell, trying to keep her voice steady, but with each word her story grew more desperate. She told of the night's encounter, of Baxter, of the policeman's words, of the system's indifference. When she finished, there was silence on the other side of the line. Finally, Bryant spoke, his voice hard, almost icy. "Are you sure it was an officer? Do you realize you're accusing a police officer of murder and threats?" "I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. He said he could get away with it, and they at the station wouldn't even listen to me. He said I could just disappear and nobody would notice." Bryant sighed heavily. "I always knew there were rotten people in our system, but this is beyond that. All right, girl, I'll be there. Will you help?" Aisha's voice shook, this time with hope. "I have to help, but realize it won't be easy. If you're right, this man will be protected by the system like everyone else. I'll have to go against my own." An hour later, there was a knock on the door. When Aisha opened the door, her uncle stood on the threshold. His face was stern, but his eyes were hard. He looked at her, then lowered his gaze to the collar in her hands. "I promise, Aisha, we won't let this go. But you have to be ready. This won't just be a fight for the truth. This is war." Aisha nodded, feeling a new feeling added to her anger. She wasn't alone now. She had an ally who knew the system inside out. "We'll find that cop first," Bryant continued. "But you have to remember, they won't play fair. If you don't back down, you'll find out how far they're willing to go to hide the truth." With those words, he opened his notebook and began to write down her story. Let's start with what he said and did. I'll gather the facts, but you'll have to remember every detail, even if it hurts. Aisha felt the determination growing inside her. She knew the path ahead would be dark and dangerous, but for the first time in all this time, she didn't feel completely helpless. Her Uncle Bryant not only understood her pain, He was willing to do anything to find justice. That was the night a light came on in her house. It was a spark that could become a fire that could destroy everything rotten in the system. But that fire could also burn them. Bryant was a man of action. The very next day, he arrived at Aisha's house armed with a notebook, a recorder, and a laptop. His gaze was focused and his movements confident. He no longer resembled the uncle she had known from her mother's stories. In front of her was a professional who knew what he was doing. "First," he said, arranging his things on the kitchen table, "we'll find out who this man is. Then we'll look for his weaknesses. But you must realize, this isn't just any officer. If he says he can get away with anything, he's got serious people behind him." Aisha nodded, her face remaining grim. She couldn't afford to show fear. "Tell me everything again, in detail. Where it happened, what you saw around you." She repeated her story, trying not to leave out any details. Bryant took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "You said he was shooting. Good. We have a shot we can check out. Are there cameras on that street?" I don't know. I was too scared to look around." "I'll take a look myself. But if there are records in there, they may have already disappeared." He stood up, grabbing his notepad and jacket. "I'll be back in a couple hours. You stay here for now." Aisha wanted to go with him, but I could read in his gaze that it was out of the question. Bryant parked the car near that very alley. He knew that looking for the truth in places like this was like digging in the dirt. The deeper you dig, the worse it smells. He scrutinized the street, noting several cameras on nearby buildings, but a particularly old camera on the corner of the store caught his attention. It might have been broken, but it was a chance. He stepped inside. The store was dark and cramped, with a counter littered with random merchandise. An older man stood behind it. "What can I do for you?" the man asked, looking at Bryant suspiciously. "I'm investigating an incident that happened last night. Are your cameras working?" The man hesitated. "Why would you want to do that? I haven't had any problems." Bryant pulled out his ID. "I'm looking for the truth. You can help, or I'll have to make an official request." The phrase worked. The man muttered something under his breath, but eventually led him to a monitor in the back. The recording was fuzzy, but the screen showed a police car pulling into the alley. The camera did not capture the incident itself, but it did capture the license plate number. "This is just what I need," Bryant said, copying the recording onto a flash drive. "Thanks for your help. If anyone asks you what I was doing here, don't say anything. It's in your best interest." Back at the department, Bryant felt that trouble awaited him. He knew that investigating police officers always attracted attention. When he walked into the department, several co-workers threw him strange looks. "Hey, Bryant!" Detective Rivers, a man with a heavy look and voice, called out to him. "What are you, back at it again? Word is, you're checking up on one of ours here." "I'm just investigating an incident. Nothing personal." Rivers smirked. "You know how it works. The system protects its own. Best not to poke around where you're not asked." "Thanks for the advice," Bryant cut off, heading for his desk. He turned on the computer and entered the patrol car's license plate number. A few minutes of waiting, and the officer's name appeared on the screen. Clayton Reed. His record was long, but covered with suspicious gaps. Several complaints of abuse of authority. None went to trial. Bryant frowned. The system was protecting Reed. That much was obvious. He made copies of the files and left the office. He knew that his every move would be monitored now. Returning to Aisha, he told her what he had found. His name is Clayton Reed, and from the looks of it, he's used his power more than once to do whatever he wants. We need more information. I'll talk to your neighbors. Aisha walked him to the door. She noticed her neighbors furtively looking out of the windows. Bryant knocked on the first door. A middle-aged woman opened it. "I didn't see anything," she said quickly before he could speak. "Look, I'm not the enemy, but if you know something, your help can make a difference." The woman looked at him apprehensively. "They saw him kill her dog, but no one will say anything. We know how it ends. First we talk and then we're gone." Bryant tried to reassure her, but he understood. Fear was deeply ingrained here. People were afraid to speak out against authority. It was exactly what Reed had hoped for. When Bryant got home, there was a message waiting for him on his answering machine. "You're a cop, Bryant. You're supposed to be with us, not against us. Stop digging. Last warning." His jaws clenched. He knew that not only his job was at stake now, but his life as well. But he couldn't stop. Aisha needed justice, and he would do anything to get it. And though he could feel the ring tightening around him, he knew this fight wasn't over yet. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Has something like this happened in your life or the lives of your loved ones? Your stories can be an important part of our discussion. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do so you don't miss the continuation. As we continue, Clayton Reed sat behind the wheel of his car, his face tense and his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The phone on the passenger seat vibrated. He reached out and took the call in one motion. "Did you hear that?" came a voice on the other end. It was his partner, Lewis. "Hear what?" Reed replied, his voice as harsh as a taut string. "Someone's poking around in your files. They say it's Bryant, the investigator from the neighboring department. You're in trouble, buddy," Reed muttered quietly. "That Bryant doesn't know who he's messing with. I'll deal with him and the girl. They'll be sorry they ever thought of going up against me." He dropped the call and started the engine. A plan was already forming in his head. This was his territory, his rules. No one would make him pay for what he thought was his right. That night, Aisha lay in her room, staring at the ceiling. She could still hear Bryant's voice in her head. "Don't be afraid, we'll get justice." But her confidence quickly faded when the screeching of brakes sounded outside the window. She jumped out of bed and went to the window. In the darkness, she saw a car driving slowly along the side of her house. Its headlights were blinding and its engine roared like a warning. Aisha noticed the driver's door open. A man stepped out of the car. Even in the darkness, she recognized his silhouette. Clayton Reed. Her heart pounded faster. He was standing right in front of the house, his gaze fixed on her window. "You think you're smarter than me, girl?" His voice echoed down the street. "You think you can win?" Aisha froze, her hands clutching the curtain so tightly that her fingers turned white. Reed took a few steps forward, his silhouette becoming more distinct. "You have to understand. If you don't stop, I'm going to make your life a living hell. That includes you and your family." He threw something onto the porch. A metallic sound echoed in the night. It was a nail, sharp and rusty, with a note attached to it. A second later, he turned around, got into his car, and drove away, leaving a cloud of exhaust behind him. Aisha didn't immediately dare to go out. When she finally reached down and picked up the note, her hands were shaking. Only 2 words were written on the paper: "You're next." The next morning, Bryant stopped by his favorite diner on his way to work. He didn't notice the same car Reed had parked behind him in the shadows. As Bryant got out with coffee in hand, the first blow caught up with him out of the blue. Someone grabbed him from behind and pushed him to the pavement. "You're digging where you shouldn't be," a voice hissed above him. Reed stood leaning on his knee, his face contorted with anger. "You think you can prove something? You're deluded." Bryant stood up, brushing the dirt off his shirt. His eyes met Reed's, and there was no fear in them. "If you thought I could be intimidated, then you underestimated me," he said coldly. Reed grinned, then stepped back and said one last thing. "If you keep this up, you'll be next on the list. That's not a threat, it's a promise." That evening, Aisha returned home after school and found the front door was ajar. Her heart sank. She cautiously stepped inside, her eyes darting over familiar objects. Everything looked to be in place, but the air in the house was heavy. She reached the kitchen and noticed the writing on the mirror in red marker. "We're watching you." Aisha called Bryant in a panic. He arrived a few minutes later, inspected the house, and took the marker for analysis. "It's Reed," he said, his voice hard. "He's trying to intimidate us." "But why? Why is he so angry? He could have just left it alone, couldn't he?" Bryant looked at her with a hard expression. "Because he's afraid. We've hit something he's trying to hide. It's probably more than just your story." That night, Bryant and Aisha didn't sleep. They sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and records. Bryant studied Reed's record. Aisha helped as much as she could. "We have to find something that will break him, something that even his friends in the system can't jam," Bryant said. Aisha nodded, her gaze focused. "If he's so afraid, then we have a chance. We can't stop now." They were exhausted at dawn, but determination burned within each of them. Reed thought he'd intimidated them, but he'd only given them a new incentive to go all the way. This fight was just beginning. Bryant was the kind of man who wouldn't give up, even when forces seemingly invincible were playing against him. His investigative instincts told him that Reed wasn't just a corrupt cop, but a man who might have a lot more dirty secrets behind him. And if those secrets came to the surface, they could be a weapon that could crush him. That night, when Bryant had stayed at Aisha's, he'd been going over the materials he'd managed to gather over the past few days. Reed's record seemed clean, save for a few closed complaints. But there was something strange behind that outward gloss. Too many coincidences. Several charges of abuse of authority that suddenly disappeared from the database. Victims who disappeared without a trace. "There's something wrong here," Bryant muttered, flipping through the pages on the screen. "It's not just coincidences. He knows how to cover his tracks." Aisha sat nearby, studying the papers with the pictures of the crime scenes. Her gaze fell on one of the complaints that particularly affected her. "Look, this is the same street where he killed Baxter, only it happened a few years ago." Bryant glanced at the document. The complaint was from an elderly man who claimed Reed had beaten him while on patrol. Like the others, it had been closed without consequence. "Too many coincidences," Bryant said, leafing on. "I'll call my old contacts. Maybe they know more than can be found in the databases." The next day, Bryant met with Jack Miller, a former colleague who had left the police force after a high-profile scandal. Jack was the kind of man who knew too much, and it had cost him his career. "You're in trouble, Bryant," Jack said when they met at a secluded cafe outside of town. "Clayton Reed isn't just a cop. He's part of the system. The system protects its own. If you start digging, they'll come after you." "I'm already digging," Bryant replied calmly. "Tell me what you know." Jack looked around to make sure no one could hear them and began to speak. "Reed's been in trouble more than once. Rudeness, abuse of authority, missing evidence. But one story stands out. A few years ago, he was suspected of killing a young boy. Black, of course. The case was closed for lack of evidence, but everyone knew it was him. The kid's parents disappeared a few months after the complaint was filed." Those words pierced Bryant like a blow to the chest. He realized he was facing something much darker than he'd imagined. "Can you help me find the records on this case?" he asked. "I can try," Jack replied. "But if they see you prying where you shouldn't, they'll wipe you out. Be ready." Back home, Bryant began searching for anything related to this old case. He came across the names of the boy's family, Jamal Williams. He'd been shot under bizarre circumstances, allegedly while trying to rob a store. Clayton Reed worked the scene. "You look," he said to Aisha, showing her the printed documents. "This isn't the first death he's left behind." Aisha, after reading the names and details of the case, felt her anger rise. "And he got away with it all? He killed a child? Not only that, look here." Bryant pointed to the dates on the report. In the past 5 years, Reed had been involved in 3 cases involving charges of abuse of power, brutality, and even missing witnesses. He's gotten away with it all. But the most shocking thing was that his activities overlapped with those of several other officers. It was a whole network that seemed to protect him. "He's part of something bigger," Bryant said. "But if we can prove that he wasn't just threatening you, but was involved in these crimes, we can break that whole structure." There was one step left: TV camera footage that could prove Reed was on the scene that night. Bryant went to his contact, a technician who agreed to retrieve the deleted data from the CCTV systems. After several hours of work, they were able to access the footage. The video clearly showed Reed's patrol car pulling into the alley. Then the sound of gunfire, followed by his figure standing over Aisha and her fallen dog. "We have this," Bryant said, glancing at the screen. "Now we can prove he was there." But that was just the beginning. The next video they found belonged to a different incident. The camera captured Reed loading something into the trunk of his car near the place where Jamal Williams' family disappeared. Bryant felt his hands clench into fists. Those tapes could change everything. But he knew that revealing such secrets would draw the attention not only of Reed, but also of those who stood behind him. Now they had a choice: go all the way, knowing it could destroy them both, or retreat, leaving this darkness alone. "We can't stop," Aisha said firmly, her eyes blazing with determination. "We have to do this, for everyone he destroyed." Bryant nodded. He knew there was no going back. All this mud would come to the surface, and someone was bound to drown in it. Bryant knew that the evidence he had found was the key, but the door it opened led to danger. He sat at the kitchen table, looking at the copies of records, witness statements, and collected materials. All of this information was like a time mine. Aisha, who had changed from a frightened girl to a determined fighter over the days, sat across from him. Her eyes showed anger, but with it came confidence. "We can't keep this between us," she said, clenching her fists. "People need to know who he really is. If we keep quiet, he keeps killing." Bryant nodded, realizing that they had already come too far to stop. "If we make it public, there will be an uproar. The system will try to defend it. They'll start attacking us, but it's the only way." The next morning, Bryant gathered his notes and went to see a journalist he trusted. His name was Tom Reynolds, an experienced reporter who specialized in exposing corruption. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Tom asked, looking at the materials. "This isn't just another case. You're going against the whole system." "I know," Bryant replied, "but if we don't do anything, no one else will. We have records, we have proof. People need to know the truth." Tom agreed. By evening, the first articles appeared on news sites, and videos proving Reed's guilt began circulating on social media. Aisha read comments where people shared their anger and support. But along with that, threats began to appear. Anonymous accounts wrote, "You just want attention." Lies. "This officer was defending our city and you're vilifying him." Bryant realized that the pressure was just beginning. The next day, major TV stations showed a press conference in which the police chief stated, "Officer Reed is a respected officer who has protected our city for years. The allegations that have appeared in the press have no basis and will be thoroughly investigated." Reed stood beside him, calm but fury in his gaze. That same night, he called Bryant. "You think you've won?" he said, his voice cold and full of threats. "But you have no idea who you're messing with. You have a family, Bryant. Think of them." "I've already thought about it," Bryant replied firmly, "and I've decided I'm not going to let people like you ruin other people's lives. So good luck." He hung up the phone, but he knew Reed wouldn't stop. The next day, someone broke into Aisha's house. They didn't take anything of value, but they tore up pictures of her family, turned over the furniture, and left the inscription on the wall, "Be silent if you want to live." Aisha, seeing this, felt fear begin to rise inside her again. But when Bryant arrived, her face was stone cold. "He thinks I'll be scared," she said, "but I won't stop." Bryant squeezed her shoulder. "We'll do this together. But we need to be more careful now." The publication of the Reed case sparked a wave of protests. People took to the streets with placards. "Justice for Jamal. Who will protect us from the police?" For the first time, Aisha felt that her story was important to others. But every day the pressure from the police increased. Threatening phone calls came to her cell phone. Someone slashed the tires on Bryant's car. Their friends began to avoid them for fear of being drawn into the conflict. A few days later, Tom Reynolds called Bryant. His voice was excited. "I've received anonymous documents. They detail the operations Reed was involved in. This isn't just abuse of authority. It's murder, withholding evidence, blackmail. I have confirmation that he was part of an entire group within the police force that covered up these crimes." Bryant looked at Aisha. "That's what we need to stop them." The next day, these documents were published. A real scandal broke out. Federal agents came to town. An investigation was launched and Reed was suspended. Aisha was walking down the street when suddenly a car stopped in front of her. The door opened and Reed got out, his face contorted with anger. "You think you've won?" he said, moving closer to her. "But it's not over. People like you don't win." Aisha raised her head, looking him straight in the eye. "You're right. This is only the beginning, but you'll never hurt anyone again." Her words were full of confidence. She knew that victory was at hand. The pressure continued to mount, but the truth finally began to break down the wall of lies and corruption. Aisha and Bryant knew they had changed not only their lives, but the lives of those who had long suffered under the system that was supposed to protect them. The noise of the crowd in the background seemed distant. In the tense courtroom, Aisha sat in the front row, clutching a folded sheet of paper. Her Uncle Bryant was beside her, his face impenetrable, but his eyes read weariness. This was their moment of truth. After weeks of investigation, threats, and tears, the case had finally gone to trial. Clayton Reed stood before the judge, a once confident officer, now looking like his world was crumbling. His lawyer tried to build a defense, accusing Aisha and Bryant of slander and manipulation, but the evidence they had gathered was undeniable. Tom Reynolds provided the court with anonymous documents that revealed the extent of the activities of Reed and his colleagues. The videotapes and witness statements were the nail in the lid of his career. The prosecutor, pointing to the screen, said, "This evidence shows that Officer Reed was involved in systematic violations of the law, abuse of authority, and covering up murders. This is not just a personal mistake. This is a pattern of behavior that lasted for years." Aisha felt her heart beating faster and faster. She knew the truth had come out, but would it be enough? When the floor was given to Reed, he stood up, his face contorted with contempt. "You think I'm a monster? I was doing my job. I was protecting this city from criminals. These people," he pointed at Aisha, "are just looking for attention. They don't know what it's like to risk their lives every day. Sometimes hard decisions have to be made, but I've always acted to protect our community." His words caused a murmur in the hall. Some nodded in agreement, but most remained cold. To them, these were empty excuses. The judge finally pronounced, "We have heard both sides and have carefully reviewed the evidence. Officer Reed, your actions undermine the credibility of law enforcement. You are charged with abuse of authority, murder, and harboring a felony. The court sentences you to—" Aisha held her breath. In that moment, she couldn't think of anything but those who could no longer be here to see this moment. Baxter, Jamal, all those whose lives had been destroyed. 25 years imprisonment. The crowd in the hall exploded. Some shouted that it was too lenient a sentence. Some argued that it was unfair. Aisha felt mixed emotions. It felt like a victory, but not enough. The system still existed. And Reed, he'd go to jail, but would that make up for everything he'd done? After the trial, Aisha stood in the street where the protesters continued to shout slogans. Suddenly, an elderly man with a tired face approached her. It was Jamal's father. His voice was hoarse but firm. "You have done more than your best. But what now? They won't stop. Reed is just the tip of the iceberg." Aisha nodded silently. She realized that this fight had only just begun, but her anger was now directed at something more. As the protesters began to disperse, Bryant approached her. "You did it," he said. "We made it through," Aisha replied. "But I still feel like it wasn't enough. He deserved more. They all deserved more." Bryant looked at her with understanding. "Revenge never gives you peace. You did the right thing. But if you want to make a bigger difference, you have to go further. Remember, the truth is your strongest weapon." Aisha looked up at the courthouse where a chapter of her life had just ended. But it was only a chapter, not the whole story. Emotions raged inside her. Joy, anger, sadness. She knew it wasn't the end, but she was ready to keep fighting. Her eyes were fixed on a future where justice was to become not just rare, but the norm. And somewhere in the distance, in the shadows of the city system, someone was probably already planning how to stop those who dared to defy. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your stories are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Share your thoughts and experiences because your voice can inspire and support others. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to our channel and give us a like to help us tell more stories like this. We wish you a good day.